Welcome everybody. Welcome. Welcome. You are at the Office of Sustainability's first virtual event for 2022 Earth Month, and we will be beginning. Oh, it's 12:02. Let's go ahead and get started now. All right. Welcome. Aloha, everybody. My name is Matthew Kamakani Lynch, and I currently serve as the Director of Sustainability Initiatives for the UH system. And before we begin the proceedings for today, to hear student perspectives on the climate crisis as the first event in our virtual Earth Month series for 22, I'd first like to begin by respectfully offering a land acknowledgement. So once again, my name is Matthew Kamakani Lynch, and like many modern humans, I am descended from long lines of peoples in displacement. My ancestors, my current generations, have been severed from the indigenous ancestral knowledge systems and the intimate relationships that our ancestors once had with very specific places in different parts of the world. My family's been living in Hawaii for 6 generations now, having originally immigrated from the Philippines to work in the islands as exploited labor in the sugarcane and pineapple plantations, which arose soon after the illegal overthrow of the Hawaii Kingdom on January 17th, 1893. And wherever you are joining us from today, we each of us still exist on land, in place, not just as disembodied faces on screens in cyberspace. So please, let's take a moment to look out a window, take a deep breath, and just sense your connection to where you are. And as we do this, I'd like to recognize Hawaii as an indigenous place and ask us all to honor all Native Hawaiians who are the ancestral descendants of these Aina, who've lived, laughed, loved, played, and cared for the many places of Hawaii for generations upon generations. Today, I'm speaking to you from my home in Kaimuki, in the Mo'o of Kalahu, in the Ahua'a of Kapahulu, in the Moku of Kona, and the Mokupuni of Oahu, in the Pai'aina of Hawaii. And I'd like to, for those of you who are joining us live, invite you to share where you are joining us from today in the chat. Your full name, if you would, and where you are joining us from today. And as you do that, I will conclude this land acknowledgement with the recognition that generations upon generations of Native Hawaiians and their indigenous knowledge systems have shaped Hawaii in ways that are so far beyond quote unquote sustainable that they allow us to enjoy these gifts even today. And for this, I am deeply grateful as a settler to this place. I seek to support the indigenous peoples of Hawaii to protect their lands and communities. And I've dedicated my own personal time and resources to working in solidarity. So with that being said, the primary purpose of today's gathering and event today is to elevate, uplift, and to hear from student perspectives and UH alumni perspectives on the climate crisis. More specifically, we'll be hearing perspectives from Hawaii's delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was held in Glasgow just last November 2021 at the Conference of the Parties, the 26th Conference of the Parties, which is often referred to in shorthand as COP26. Before we hear from our students, I would like to introduce and turn the mic over, as it were, to Chip Fletcher, who currently serves as the interim dean for the School of Ocean and Earth Sciences and Technology at UH Manoa. He's also chairperson of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission and is our resident expert on all things climate. Chip, welcome to today.
Thank you, Matt, and aloha, everybody, on this April 1st. Thanks for joining us. The Glasgow COP was the most recent opportunity for the world's nations to update their pledges to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You know that the goals that were signed on to in the 2015 COP in Paris were to stop global warming before it reached 2 degrees C and to make concerted efforts to halt the warming before 1.5 degrees C. And shortly after that, in 2018, a report came out reporting on what would the world be like at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average global temperature. And that report shocked everybody. It showed that human food and water security was threatened. Marine and terrestrial ecologies were threatened. And 1.5 with that report became the de facto target for stopping global warming. The Glasgow COP pledges that were announced by the world's nations, when you add them up, their promises to cut greenhouse gas emissions put us on a pathway to stopping warming someplace between 2.5 and 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. More than a degree Celsius warmer than the 1.5 target, and even above the 2.0 degree Celsius target. But those are pledges, those are promises, and the actual policies that nations are investing in, engaged in, and publicly announcing in terms of energy infrastructure, those actual policies put us on a pathway to 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial surface temperature. At 3 degrees Celsius warming, models tell us that roughly 1/5 of the land surface on this planet will be experiencing heat and humidity combinations that will make it intolerable for human life, for human communities. And we'll be setting in motion roughly 1/3 of humanity as we approach and hit this extremely dangerous warming level. Worse, it turns out, based on a report that came out during the Glasgow meeting from the Washington Post, that on average, greenhouse gas emissions around the world are underreported by 23%. 23%. And we also learned a month ago from the International Energy Agency that methane emissions alone are underreported by 70%, 70%. Now, because of beef agriculture, mining, hunting, mineral exploitation, deforestation that's taking place across the planet, and the heating of the tropics, we are seeing a decline in the terrestrial biome photosynthetic capacity to pull CO2 out of the air. In other words, on average, every year, we emit a little less than 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the air, and roughly 30% of that is absorbed by photosynthesis taking place on land. Models are now projecting that sink, that drawdown of carbon dioxide is going to be cut in half in only 20 years. And this is because photosynthesis has a thermal maximum. And we've already reached temporarily, gone past that thermal maximum and come back down again. But past this thermal maximum, plants actually rapidly decrease their uptake of carbon, and they rapidly increase their release of carbon dioxide. And we've already seen numerous papers identifying the Amazon basin as now having pivoted from a carbon sink to a carbon source. On average, over the last decade, the Amazon rainforest, which holds more than half of the tropical rainforest on this planet, absorbed 15 billion tons of carbon dioxide, but released 18 billion tons. So we are looking at major global biophysical systems that are being pushed to the very brink of existence. Of course, this threatens human security around the planet, as well as here in Hawaii. So these COPs are critical meetings. And the next COP is in Egypt. And it is absolutely critical that we not only stop global warming and greenhouse gas emissions, but that we end deforestation, we end development that destroys nature. Because as we destroy these natural places, we are releasing pathogenic microbes, and we have now entered into the era of pandemics. All of this adds up to our fourth global crisis, which is human inequity, human inequality, because those who are least responsible for these problems suffer the most. And because of climate change, the distance, the economic distance between the upper 10% on this planet and the lower 10% on this planet is 25% wider than it would be without climate change. So I will end with this surprising conclusion. We are lucky to be here now. This is the decade, and we are the ones called on. We are lucky to have the honor of carrying this duty forward for our children and grandchildren. And I'll end with that thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chip, Mahalo, for that update. So I'd like to now frame the conversation that we are going to dive into with a question, with a framing question. So as we explore the different topics today and hear from different perspectives about COP26 and the climate crisis and our responses, let us all hold in mind this sort of underpinning question, or this overarching question. What can and should the university be doing to effectively equip our students and our communities to navigate uncertain climate futures? And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator today, Richard Walsgrove, who's an assistant professor working with the Environmental Law program at the UH William S. Richardson School of Law. You may also know Richard from such duties as serving as the policy director for the Blue Planet Foundation for many years. Richard, take it away.
Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you, Chip. I don't know if enough of us in the community thank you for being the person who sort of keeps us up to date on the science and the policy on this. And the message that I heard there at the end resonates with the slightly more disturbing things we heard as you were presenting the state of the climate. You know, something like underreporting methane emissions, for example, is a huge opportunity. We can cut those emissions. They actually have it's an opportunity for a near-term impact on our climate. And so I think part of the sort of rationale for Matt's question, what can the university be doing, is calling on us to do some soul searching. What do we do in our own lives at home? What do we do, you know, as a UH community? What do we do in Honolulu? What do we do as the state of Hawaii? What do we do in the Pacific? And then, of course, what do we do globally? And that's the point of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Just to set us all up for those who are tuning in and aren't as familiar with the wonky acronyms like COP and UNFCCC. This framework convention is a treaty. It was signed in 1992. We shouldn't be lulled into thinking that climate action is a new thing, that climate urgency is a new thing. The explicit goal of the framework convention back in 1992 was to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that would avoid dangerous human interference with the climate system. So we sort of know what we need to do on that front. And it didn't occur to me until I went to my first COP that someplace like Honolulu or UH or Hawaii could have a role in this global sphere. That framework convention does something interesting. First of all, it doesn't allow us to acknowledge that we've failed just because 30 years on from 1992, we haven't yet achieved the goal. the Framework Convention was designed so that it would be a living thing. And every year, the global community gets together. Every UN member state has agreed that this is a goal we need to work on. They've agreed on the urgency. And these meetings are at their core, they are meetings of the United Nations community. But they allow observer parties. These are official delegations that attend, and we are there to hold the UN community's feet to the fire. Matt and the Office of Sustainability had the foresight a few years ago to apply for that membership. UH is now a member, along with a number of other research institutes around the world and business organizations around the world and community groups around the world. And our delegation goes each year. It's comprised of people who are committed to this issue. The rest of my job today is to introduce you to those people and let you hear their perspectives on COP and UH's role. So our first delegate, the first person to hear from, is Joe Udell. Joe is a third-year law student here at the William S. Richardson School of Law. Joe came to me and us and asked to go to the COP. And so Joe, I'd like to ask you to share two things. First of all, can you tell us your COP highlight? What stands out in your sort of memory of the experience in Glasgow? But why did you want to go? What motivated you to ask to go to the COP?
Hey, Professor Wells-Robin. I'm actually glad I get to speak first, because I have the feeling my COP highlight might be someone else's COP highlight. It was actually the first COP event that I attended, along with myself, Professor Fletcher, Colin Lee, Scott Glenn was there. But as soon as we arrived in the event space, we get an immediate text from Professor Maxine Burkett, who is my international law professor who's working with the Biden administration, asking us if we wanted to see President Obama speak on small island resilience. And so, of course, the answer was yes. And we all immediately descended on the meeting point from different places throughout the venue. Meanwhile, we waited outside for these tickets to get in, I think for about 15 minutes. It was like trying to get backstage at a concert and to actually, in this case, see a rock star former president. And he was every bit as engaging and just thought-provoking as you see in the news prior to that. And he talked about his experiences growing up in Hawaii and how his worldview was shaped by that. And so that was just an incredible introduction to COP26. I don't think everyone's first experience at the COP is like that, so I'm very grateful that was my own, and it's always going to be a fond highlight of mine. But as far as why I wanted to go to the COP, you mentioned I'm a third-year law student, so I was just trying to figure out what I want to do with life after law school. And the COP26 was sort of this very tangible, real-world event that for me was sort of everything I built up to in my extracurricular and academic experiences. So a lot of my work in the summers and during my externships was sort of geared towards addressing the climate crisis, climate litigation, clean energy initiatives, and also working within the UN system. And immediately before the COP happened, I got an opportunity to co-write a chapter on duty of care developments in climate litigation with Christina Voigt, who is the chair of the IUCN WCEL and a climate negotiator with Norway. And this is going to be part of a larger guidebook on best practices for judges who are looking at the climate litigation issues. And I got invited to a side event that discusses this project in addition to other climate litigation issues at the University of Strathclyde at the same time as the COP. And so it just sort of like, there's a light bulb that went off. I could go and meet my fellow collaborators at this event, also potentially attend this monumentally important event for addressing climate change, also try to figure out what my role is as someone from Hawaii, someone who's going to be graduating from Richardson and wants to work within this space and do my part in addressing the climate crisis. And after 2 years of working remotely, also get a chance to interface with people who are interested in similar issues. And the fact that it was able to happen was just a dream come true. So I'm incredibly grateful for the university, for my professors, and for the opportunity to meet everyone on this panel here today.
Thanks, Joe. And for everybody in the audience, please feel free to suggest questions if there are things you'd like to hear from any of the delegates as we go. Evan Miyake will take those questions and funnel them through to me so that we make sure the panelists get to the topics you'd like to talk about. Also, to our delegates, please feel free to ask questions of each other. So if anybody wants to react or reflect on what Joe just shared, chime in. I'm going to use the moderator's privilege, Joe, to ask one follow-up question and just say, so you were there, you were in the thick of things, the negotiations are happening on the ground. I know it was a little bit different because of the COVID situation, but what did you learn that you didn't learn in school and that you didn't learn with these other opportunities you've been working on? So what do you take away from the COP?
I mean, there's so many different takeaways. I mean, on the larger scale, so much of the media attention was focused on these climate negotiations. I was accredited for the second week of the COP. So when I was there, it was sort of the crunch time in these negotiations. Can an agreement be reached? What's going to be the terms of the agreement? And due to the COVID protocols, we couldn't be in the actual negotiation space, but the plenary discussions were open. And that was sort of a state of the negotiations every day. And every single day that I was there, I made an attempt to go to this plenary discussion. And you can actually feel the discussions and how palpable and tense they were. So that was just an incredible insight into what these negotiations, what goes into them, which you don't often get, watching a video online or reading about what happens in the negotiations in the media. So that was great, even if I wasn't able to get into the negotiation room itself. But beyond that, just as I mentioned before, to be able to meet people who are interested in this and figure out what my role and potential place is, walking around the COP event space, being able to actually meet someone from these international organizations, talk story with them, and just sort of be inspired and educated about what an individual's role can be. And so I mentioned I'm interested in climate litigation and climate policy. For me, it was a confirmation that I want to continue working in that space, and that there is opportunities for that moving forward. And to be honest, if there aren't a lot of opportunities, I think that, touching on what Professor Fletcher mentioned earlier, I think the world's in a lot of trouble. So on one hand, I think that there's a lot of we have an uphill journey to address the issues that are in front of us with the climate crisis. But I'm also optimistic that there's so many people who are interested in this, and that there is sort of a pathway to address these issues and also give back in our own home communities.
Thanks for sharing that, Joe. And I think I can speak on behalf of the entire environmental law program when we say thank you for the interest you've shown and the decision you've made to keep working on these issues going forward. Why don't we meet our next delegate? So our next delegate is a second-year law student here at the law school, Naima Te Maile Fifita. And Naima, I would like to start with the same request to you. If you could share your personal COP highlight, and then also tell us a little bit about why you also sort of on your own affirmatively came up and asked to attend the COP this year.
Sure. So aloha, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all and my amazing mentors and colleagues. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm calling from Nu'uanu Valley in Honolulu, Oahu. And my family roots are in Tuvalu, which is in the heart of the South Pacific, about midway between Hawaii and Australia. In terms of my professional and environmental law background, I spend a lot of my time working with environmental nonprofits and conservation organizations, mostly those that are focused on supporting Pacific communities mitigate impacts of climate change by integrating Indigenous wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge. So I'm very passionate about environmental justice, climate migration policy, and strengthening cross-cultural competencies throughout my legal and nonprofit work. And then before I begin, I have to express my gratitude to the Pettit Family Travel Fund and the Environmental Law Program for their generosity and for making it possible for me to attend the COP26 in October. So they gave me the opportunity to learn about my role, how I could better pay this experience forward at the law school and in my home community. So for them, I thank you. So in terms of why I decided to attend the COP, my reasons for attending law school and for attending the COP 26 are actually the same. They're a direct result of my family's experience as Tuvaluan and Marshallese citizens, many of whom have been immediately impacted by climate change and rising sea levels, and have had to migrate from their homelands, unable to return for fear of impending climate threats and loss of both inhabitable and agricultural land. So I think in terms of the COP outcomes and implications for small Pacific Islands, there was a mix of optimism and disappointment. And I can get into that later, but I think, I was there for the first week, and the focus areas for that week included finance, energy, youth empowerment, and nature. And because this was my first COP experience, I had very little to compare it to and no real expectations as to what it was going to be like. And I can say my goal in attending the COP was to connect with and learn from the precious number of Pacific Island delegations, especially Tuvalu, that were intent on spreading a message of urgency about the climate crisis. So most of the programs I attended were centered on amplifying Indigenous voices and underlying this greater need for responsibility or accessibility to spaces like the COP and greater representation and platforms for Indigenous peoples' voices to be heard. And they were all fascinating. So I'll just share a few salient takeaways that have stuck with me to this day. The first being that the first event I attended actually was an Indigenous Leaders Roundtable event. And I recall a leader from Brazil emphasizing that although humanity is on this quest to find just solutions to climate change, many Indigenous communities around the world already have the solutions. They live with them. Indigenous people have wisdom for navigating this crisis. And so the question is, are we letting them share it with us, the world? And is the world listening? So I think about that quite a lot in my work now, in my environmental education. And it was also my personal mission as a Tuvaluan descendant to find someone from the delegation and ask them a few questions about what they felt was going well or lacking at the COP. And so I was able to connect with Mr. Seve Paenu, who is the Minister of Finance of Tuvalu, and Kato Erekia, who is the only youth who was able to attend from Tuvalu. And I asked both of them many questions, but the response from the Minister of Finance will always stay with me. And that is, so I asked whether he agreed with the drowning island rhetoric that was often employed in conversations about Tuvalu and other small island states' plight against the climate crisis. So I had grown up with this notion that the idea of Pacific Islands sinking or drowning sort of gave this impression that islands suffering from climate change were weak and vulnerable instead of strong and resilient. And interestingly, Mr. Seve said that it had come to the point where he did agree with this rhetoric because of what he was seeing on a daily basis in Funafuti, which is the capital of Tuvalu. And he told me about how during the storm season, he saw these tides build on one side of the island and crash down on the other. And that was something he had never seen before in his entire life. So I left Glasgow feeling like I had a deeper understanding of the issue that Tuvalu was facing and actively seeking to address, and a better sense of how I could use my legal education to help guide its efforts.
Thank you, Naima. Having known both you and Joe for a few years now, I find it remarkable how much I learned from both of you. And I should tell you all that Naima is working on a powerful paper related to climate adaptation and perspectives from the Pacific. I fully expect that she'll publish that and you'll all get to read it soon enough. Naima, I mean, because I know how knowledgeable you are about climate policy, I'm curious to get your take on the disappointment piece and the optimism piece that you mentioned, in terms of the policy outcomes at the COP for the global community. Can you give us an example of each of those two buckets?
Sure. So yeah, as I said before, I think there was in terms of the outcomes and implications for Pacific Islands, there was a mix of optimism and disappointment. Australasia's larger countries' refusal to support funding for loss and damage suffered by Pacific countries was considered a sort of deep betrayal of the region. And I think there's a lot of anxiety that the 1.5 degree target is not suitable. It's barely alive. Then the phasing down of coal was, of course, a point of optimism, I suppose. But at the end of the day, Pacific countries are feeling as though their efforts and their countries' realities were not sufficiently acknowledged by developed and wealthy countries, who are ultimately the ones to determine the direction of these commitments and outcomes. So there's this sentiment at the COP where they must go back and forth about minimal changes in the text, that it's an ineffective process for creating meaningful outcomes, and it produces a lot of fatigue. And so I think we can expect more, thankfully, more initiatives in the near future that focus on facilitating collaboration and leadership at the subnational, national, private sector, and even community level to implement substantial change. And one example of this is underway, and that is the Small Island States Commission, which was established on November 1st of 2021. And there we saw the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and the Prime Minister of Tuvalu signing an accord that establishes this commission, which will be seeking an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. So this is just one example. Of course, other groups in the South Pacific are seeking advisory opinions from the International Court of Justice. And so, I think this is really an opportunity because of the disappointment Pacific Island countries have experienced in spaces like COPs. I think they are looking for more creative solutions, thinking way outside of the box in terms of legal policies and climate negotiations, and trying to, pushing forward, not giving up.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Naima. I mean, as you can tell from Naima and Joe both, they're very thoughtful. So send in the questions. There are a few coming in. I think we'll figure out a way to corral those together and get the panelists to talk. Let's go through and meet a few more of the delegates before we get to that point. So next we have somebody who I'm going to call a UH student, but in truth, he's a recent graduate. This is Colin Lee. He graduated from the law school last year in 2021 and got scooped up by Chip Fletcher and SOAS to work as a climate policy analyst. And Joe and Naima, as I've mentioned to you, they sort of took the bull by the horns and said, we want to go to COP as students. And I can tell you that Colin has the same tendency. I first met him when he was an undergraduate, and he reached out to me and said, hey, can I come work for you, when I was back with the Blue Planet Foundation. So Colin, we're curious to hear your perspective too, even though it's not quite so fair to call you a student at this stage. Can I ask you to start with a story of your COP highlight? What stands out from your experience there? And then maybe to follow up and tell us a little bit about what you learned at the COP that you didn't learn when you were a student.
Thank you, Professor Walsgrove. Yes, as Professor Walsgrove mentioned, I had a little bit of a different journey to the COP. I have been an attorney now for about 3 months and have spent the last 3 years of my life as a law student, which is stressful and challenging in its own right. And so in my mind, I was focusing on the bar exam and such. And I was extremely lucky to get a job with Dr. Fletcher on his new initiative called the Climate Resilience Initiative. And through that, he got funding to bring himself and myself to the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. So first, I'd like to thank Chip for giving me that opportunity, and also my professors at Richardson, including Professor Walsgrove, Professor Antolini, and Professor Foreman for all of their guidance and leadership throughout law school and teaching about environmental law issues. The COP, in my experience, to give a more broad sense of it, it was pandemonium. This was my first COP, so I had no prior knowledge of it. And this COP was very much underscored by the global pandemic that was going on. There were so many security measures and background measures that we had to do prior to leading up that it was just so much work just to even get there for all of us, not to mention lodging and such. And when you get there, there's hundreds of thousands of protesters in the city. The public infrastructure and streets are closed. And it was a lot to take in. I was there during the second week of the COP, which the way that I learned it kind of works out is Leaders from countries show up either sometimes with things that seem to be already agreed upon, and they announce them immediately within the first day or two. And then the remainder of it during the second week, you're almost waiting on bated breath for this hope that something else big will happen. And this year, unfortunately, that kind of just slowly faded. There are panel discussions on every topic under the sun. I had trouble keeping up. I had hoped to literally have a schedule for myself and Chip going in, and I realized just every day was going to be different. Every day was going to be last minute everything. Every day was going to be checking the WhatsApp group to see what other people were doing, what other people had heard about. Joe stole my thunder. My highlight was going to be former President Barack Obama's speech at the Islands conference. You know, that as every day was just pandemonium. You get there, and there's just also this in the news it had shown that he had flown in that night, the night before, to Glasgow, so everybody knew he was going to show up. Everybody knew he was in the building. There's literally people sprinting across the entire venue to figure out how to where he is, how to see him. And the generous Professor Maxine Burkett, who was working with the Kerry administration and still is, was so thoughtful that she allowed us to all get tickets. And actually, in the process, Director Glenn and Dr. Fletcher gave up their tickets to Joe, as Joe mentioned. So that was really generous of them, although everybody eventually did get to attend. And that was a really insightful panel. It was incredible. I mean, I felt like a fanboy in one sense, but it was also really incredible to see, you know, all these heads of state and diplomats speaking to each other in this formal setting. And it was a lot to take in, and it was incredible. It was also impressive to see how a lot of Pacific Island leaders did not have favorable views about the policies coming out of the United States and some of the actions. So that was definitely my highlight.
Colin, can I switch directions on you really quickly? You mentioned something that I think is interesting. This dialogue that you were sort of a fly on the wall for with global leaders. Were they talking about climate change and climate policy in a way that sounded familiar from the way we talk about it here at UH, or were they talking about it in a different way somehow?
There were a lot of familiarities. You know, being that we're an island state and these are island nations, we are at risk of not only losing or of not only increasing temperatures, but literally losing land, losing housing. Our populations are extremely vulnerable. The majority of them living right within the coastal zone, and now having worked for Dr. Fletcher, learning so much more about how impactful sea level rise will be on our coastal communities. And you know, island nations have suffered the loss of land, the migration of their populations, and it's getting worse. And you know, they are literally powerless to change what larger nations are doing. Developed nations are doing, the Western world is doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And they're just they have to figure it out for themselves, and they have no power to control sea levels.
So I know that after the COP that you and Chip went to do some investigation. It almost seems to me like you were trying to empower us here in Hawaii by learning more about how other places are dealing with climate change mitigation. Can you share a little bit about the follow-up work that you did in Iceland and what you've been looking into since then?
Yes. So following the COP in Glasgow, I traveled with Dr. Fletcher and Director Glenn to Reykjavik, Iceland. We went on a journey to get tours of geothermal facilities, hydroelectric facilities, carbon capture facilities, storage facilities, with the ultimate goal that kind of goes back to the COP. You know, countries make pledges. We have our state pledge to have 100% renewable energy, and also more than carbon neutrality, but carbon negativity, both by 2045. And the question then becomes, how do we achieve that? You know, it's being developed globally, but Iceland has been a leader in terms of you know, renewable energy from geothermal and other sources, and then also now carbon capture and storage. And you know, our state has the potential to. Our state has legally mandated requirements that we become net negative in terms of carbon, and 100% renewable. And now the question becomes, how do we achieve that? And learning from other countries and private research and development about the technologies that are available for carbon capture and storage, geothermal energy is going to be crucial, because that's one big hope of the COP, is that, you know, you put everybody in the people working on the issues in the same room, and hopefully they can learn from each other. And that's ultimately the goal of the Iceland trip, is to get a first-hand account of how these processes can work, and to take those solutions home and try to see if there's some avenue that we can pursue them from the university.
I know that you and Chip have now written up some of the lessons learned from Iceland, and I assume that's available to everybody. Maybe if there's a link or something, you could stick it in the chat, Colin, so folks can take a look at it. Or if not, I'll figure out a way to email it later. You let me know. Go ahead.
We are working on something. There's been one publication so far, but it's going to be updated, and so it might be best to wait until the updated publication is available.
Okay, sounds like a plan. I will wait on bated breath to read it. We're gonna stretch our definition of student and student perspectives out even further here, and we will meet another graduate of the University of Hawaii, but somebody who now thankfully sits in a leadership role at the state, and it's a leadership role that I think is both important as the head of the state energy office, but also is being used in a really effective way. You heard Colin talking about the state's policy to become carbon negative. Well, I can tell you that the state leader who has made that sort of a mantra, has reminded us that that's what the statute says, if you read it correctly, is Scott Glenn, the director of the State Energy Office. So Scott, thanks for sort of sitting in with the UH delegation today. You're an honorary member of the UH delegation for at least one day, but you were there at COP as part of the Hawaii state delegation. And so from that perspective, I'd like to hear something about your highlights. What, did you see similar things or different things from what Naima and Joe and Colin saw? And then maybe if you can, with your state hat on, if you could share your perspectives on how you think UH can support the state's efforts in something like, the COP and global climate policy.
Thanks, Richard. And it's really exciting to be here with you guys today. But I also feel like I'm stretching the definition a little bit by being a planning student and not a law student participating in this. So it's okay for non-lawyers as well to get involved besides Chip. Well, one of the highlights for me, this is my third COP. So I've been fortunate to go to two others. The first one was in Germany. The second one was in Spain. I did not go to the one in Poland. And each time that I've gone, it's been through the US Climate Alliance, which is the organization of US states that have committed to the Paris Agreement. And it formed when Trump, as president, withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement. And several states, including Hawaii, stepped forward and said, well, we don't care what you guys are doing at the federal level. This is the right thing to do, and we're going to do it. And Hawaii is, I think, the only state, there might be one or two others, though, that made that commitment to act in a way consistent with the Paris Agreement through statute. So we have a Paris Agreement law that we say, for shorthand, we're committed to this Paris Agreement. The real text of the statute is we've committed ourselves to mitigate and adapt to climate change in a way that's consistent with the US's share and commitment to the Paris Agreement, which is to say that whatever the United States' NDC is, nationally determined contribution, we've committed ourselves to do our part by law under that NDC. And even if the NDC isn't there, we're still going to do what our part was under whatever previous NDC was filed. Which is what we did when the president at that time withdrew it. We basically said we're sticking with Obama's NDC and we're going to move forward using that. And now that President Biden has submitted a new one, that's now our guiding star in terms of mitigation and adaptation for climate change, to the extent we're working on this from the Paris Agreement point of view. Coming this third time to this one in Glasgow, this was my first time though coming with the governor. So the previous two was myself and Suzanne Case, the chairperson of the Department of Land and Natural Resources. And she and I have attended in our capacities as effectively the climate mitigation and the climate adaptation policy leads for the state. And the Energy Office does have a mandate in statute to address decarbonization. And just to get a little wonky on the energy side, in the state's greenhouse gas inventory, 85% of all emissions in the state are tied to energy. And that doesn't even count the international travel from Hawaii to international destinations, the jet fuel used for that. If you add that in, the number goes up even higher. So energy is very much the mitigation nexus for Hawaii. And so governors asked me in that role to take that lead. On the adaptation side, of course, it makes sense that the chairperson responsible for 80% of our land in Hawaii would take that role on. So the two of us went this year, the two of us went this year with Governor, his first time at a COP. And it's a very different experience when you show up with a governor. They're treated as VIPs and they get, to skip all the lines in security. They get to get driven around everywhere. It's a totally different experience from someone just showing up and being an attendee and a delegate. But for me, one of the really exciting highlights was being able to get governors' attention on climate change for effectively a full week, where every day, all day, he was focused on climate change. And he was spending almost every single day with his peers. The governor of Washington State, Governor Inslee, the governor of Oregon, Governor Kate Brown, and other governors who were there as well. But really those two were with Governor Ige at multiple events daily. And we got into a really good exchange where you could see them inspiring each other. So on one of the first days we were there, they were giving some speeches, and Governor Inslee happened to say in one of his speeches, we're looking at electric airplanes as part of our clean energy push. And so then after that speech was done, Governor Ige came up to me and said, didn't we have something with electric planes happening in Hawaii? I said, yes. And so I briefed him on it. And then the next day, they were at another event speaking. And Governor Ige says in his speech, well, Washington might be looking at electric planes, but we're testing electric planes on Maui. We had an electric plane fly between Kahului and Hana by Ampere. And so, the next day, Inslee, in his speech that at an event we're at, goes, we're manufacturing the electric planes that are being test flown in Maui. And so you could see they're both learning, they're responding, they're raising the bar on each other. And it was really meaningful. And, I work with Inslee's climate policy advisors as well as Kate Brown's and the other governors. And so we already knew each other. We already talking and helping each other, but it became an even richer relationship through that. And so it's one of those rare opportunities where you can really get an executive's entire focus on one issue. And so and I'm sure for the presidents and prime ministers and others as well, it's just as valuable to get them to go to something like this and have their singular focus. It's invaluable. Richard, is that maybe pause there with that story?
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting highlight. And the fun thing about being moderator is you can say things that get people in trouble. So I'll say that I'm looking forward to Governor Glenn's speech at COP, whatever it is, as you ascend in the state's leadership hierarchy. So we're thinking about, I think that's a great story. I have a hard time articulating the value of the COP because there are some costs, right? There are certainly some inequities in terms of who has access. Naima's mentioned some of those, and just getting there means we have to offset our carbon emissions from flying and that sort of thing. But this idea of a sort of competition, a policy ratchet as people compare themselves to their peers is powerful. What can UH do to help with that? As we send delegates to COP, what do you think UH's role in this competition is?
It's tremendous. I think what we heard at this COP is everyone's hungry for action. Everyone wants to know what's being done, what can we do, what are the examples, what are the best practices, what's worked where, and can we do it ourselves? And I think that's the value of universities and what the University of Hawaii can bring, having our students understand what is this international dialogue, what are the needs, and then being able to come back home and help develop the best practices, develop the research, develop the the actions on the ground, be a part of it, and then know how to translate that into these other domains, take it out of the, the kalo fields of Waimanalo and show how what you did there is meaningful to the world. And I think a lot of folks look to Hawaii for that role. We live in multiple worlds, but I think in this context, it's important that Hawaii is a US state and we're also a Pacific island. And it's, the Pacific Islands that got 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement in the first place, right? They were the ones who said 2 degrees isn't enough. It's not good enough. And similarly, Governor Ige went to the COP to say the race to zero isn't good enough. The race to zero is settling for 2 degrees, and we need to aim for 1.5. And so we have to go beyond zero. We have to pursue negative emissions. We have to look at, sequestration in trees and soils and geologic sequestration, which is why Chip and Colin and I went to Iceland. And these are all things that Hawaii is already leading on. A lot of times we just don't know it. And we haven't connected with other folks about it. Or other folks have been looking at Hawaii, drawing lessons from it, but not knowing who to talk to, and in turn, how to translate it. So I think there's a tremendous capability there in the university to support us, and also as a state delegation to attend and back us up as well with understanding the negotiations and what are the sticking points and what are the various, very technical terms being argued, helping us as state officials who may or may not be up to speed on how COPs work or all the lingo, being able to support us in that way. I think that's important. And frankly, I think it's faculty and students. It's not just students. It's also, I think our faculty bring a lot. They're globally recognized researchers, and having them there connecting with other globally recognized researchers is important. That's why we felt it was so important for Chip to be there with the research that he's been doing. And I know maybe I'll put this back on you a little bit. It's a little controversial to talk about astronomy these days, but the Mauna Loa Observatory is where we nailed down the science that climate change is unequivocally happening. And the whole world that engages in the COP knows that's where we did the definitive measurements for climate change, that the planet is heating up.
I should explain a little bit about the complicated institutional structure of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Like all UN bodies, it has a complicated structure, but there are a series of constituencies with different expertise, if you will. And so, Scott, you're there as the sort of the governmental, the subnational jurisdictional constituency. UH attends as part of this research and non-governmental organization constituency. So I think one of the powerful things is that to the extent that you are spending time with Joe and Naima and Colin, and we can sort of develop a unified message, and it comes in from different perspectives because those constituencies have an audience with the leaders, with the UN leaders at the COP. So thanks for being there, and thanks for not forgetting that you are part of our honorary UH delegation. Let's keep meeting. We have 3 more delegates to hear from before maybe we turn to some of the questions that are coming in. So I'd like to go next to David Foreman, the director of the Environmental Law Program. I should tell you all a little bit of a story about why it is that the law school and ELP, as we affectionately call it, have taken the lead on building up these COP delegations. A few years ago, right after I first joined the faculty here, in conjunction with an international environmental law class I was teaching, the students and I had this idea that we should attend the COP because UH has this observer status and hasn't yet sent a delegation. This seemed like a crazy idea, but I raised it with David and Denise, and they were immediately and unequivocally supportive of it. And I know that David is always looking at things through the lens of what's best for the students. So David, here's my question for you. I think we have some students in the audience here, potential future UH delegates. And so in addition to sharing your COP highlights with us, could you share some advice on what you would say to students who will be delegates in the future, how to get the most out of it for them, for their educational journey, and then how to make the most of this opportunity to influence something like the governor's perspective on climate change or the UN's perspective on climate change? What are your words of wisdom?
Thanks for that introduction, Richard. I guess if I were to say a highlight, one of them, you've heard from Naima before, because of the pandemic, the first time I got to meet Naima in person was in Glasgow, along with Professor Antolini. And so that was certainly a highlight after having worked with her and been in Marseille with Joe at the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Conservation Congress. And so to be with Naima and Joe was rewarding. You know, we try to provide these opportunities for the students, but to see them absorbing and engaging with folks on an international scale was really immensely rewarding. And I actually was able to introduce Naima to some folks in person who she had collaborated with before as a result of some of our early initiatives. I had traveled to Vanuatu at the invitation of the Pacific Island students fighting climate change. And there was a Solomon Islander there who founded that group, who had extended the invitation. And I had spoke to them about efforts around the world of youth that were working on climate change. And so I had the opportunity to interact with that group and to plug Naima into that group, and then attend some meetings with some of their international council working on an effort to get the United Nations to address in an advisory opinion the obligations of states dealing with the climate crisis. So that was really a rewarding experience. I think Naima, thanks to a colleague that was at the COP on behalf of Stop Ecocide Foundation, who also does all kinds of environmental advocacy training for students across the globe, including Harvard University, and we're hoping to get her to Hawaii. But she was the conduit for Kato Eviak, who Naima had mentioned was the only youth from Tuvalu. And so I was able to put the two of them together, and that was something that really translated to the benefit of our students who weren't able to attend, because Naima set up a session on Pacific climate resiliency and included Solomon Yeo from Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, Kato Eviak, as well as Professor Payam Akavan, who's the counsel for the Commission on the Small Island States, which Naima mentioned before. And so that was really fantastic to see that contribution. And that kind of, well, before I respond to your question about my advice to students on how to get the most out of it, another highlight for me was one of these side events. I went and listened to a pan-generational panel, and it featured a young 19-year-old woman from Mexico now studying in the United States named Gia Bastide, and she was on a panel with Dr. Sylvia Earle. And it was just really captivating. I mean, it was the frustration of youth, but at the same time, respecting the important contributions that people like Dr. Earle have been making for generations, rather than just criticizing us older folks for not having moved us far enough along the journey. And it was really a captivating experience. I think it's reflective in ways that I've seen our students accomplish thanks to the training that Professor Antolini and Professor Walsgrove have provided our students on interacting on international environmental law issues. And I see Diego and Alyssa, at least, if not others, are listening in on this call. And so seeing that happen is really exciting. And what I guess my advice to students is, prepare, have your agenda set out, what sessions do you want to attend, like Colin had suggested, but then have the flexibility to adjust when something new and exciting comes up. I had planned on, really my main goal was to try to help facilitate networking efforts for our students, but I'd also wanted to sit in on many of the local communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform events that Naima had referenced. And so that was really rewarding, because one of our former students, LLM, Clement Yo Mulalap, has a leadership role on LSIP, along with Professor Maxine Burkett, who was also referenced. And so to see them on that stage making an impact at a global level was also really heartening to see the impacts that Hawaii can have on that important stage. So I think, think about what drives you, what you're most passionate about, and tell us about it so that we can try to help facilitate those opportunities and draw upon our international connections to create opportunities for you to explore those kinds of possibilities.
I think I forgot to mention that David is also an alum of the university. And so we continue to stretch out this definition of student perspectives pretty wide there. I can't imagine either as an undergraduate student or a law student that I would have understood the possibility that I could step into a leadership role at someplace like a COP. And yet we see somebody like Clement there, who he's not just in the LSIP conversations, but he's also got a leadership role with the Alliance of Small Island States, and he's just sort of gaining influence at every COP in some ways. Here, sort of a question for you, not thinking through the lens of a law student, but thinking through the lens of an undergraduate student who wants to get involved in this sort of thing, right? UN climate negotiations seems so impossible, but now we know it isn't. Do you have any advice you might tailor towards the undergrads?
I would first repeat the observation I made before about letting us know that you're interested. I would certainly love to have undergraduate involvement. I think that was always the goal. We started out because we had connections with law students who we could encourage to make the commitment necessary to get involved, because it does require a commitment, both educating yourself, being trained, and then taking yourself out of classes for a couple of weeks and making arrangements with your professors, et cetera, getting all your other work done. So the kinds of juggling that you'll have to do when you get out into the real world. But to let us know about that and explore the myriad of ways that you could get involved. And so if we know a little bit more about where your passions lie or what kinds of experiences that you have, then we can do a better job of plugging you into opportunities that will present themselves at these kinds of international conferences. And I think it's really important for youth to be involved. And so that's been something that even I would stretch it even further. At a previous international conference, the woman I mentioned, Shirlene Shin with Green Transparency, introduced me to a colleague from China. And she asked me, why I was at this event. And I explained the desire to get more young people involved in these international conversations. And this woman happened to be hosting on Weibo or one of the venues, a session with youth in China. So she had 1,000 youth, and she asked me to speak to the 1,000 youth in China. And so I did it from that international venue and encouraged those folks to reach out and get involved. And so I hope that more people from Hawaii, including students at the University of Hawaii and our community colleges, would express interest and let us know, or even our high school students. I know we've got a lot of high school students that are passionate about this. And so I'd be really excited about exploring ways to make that possible.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think the same is true for all the ELP faculty. We welcome undergraduates just the same as we welcome law students to reach out to us. We've got a group of high school students coming to the law school this summer to do some energy justice work with me, and I'm excited about that. So lots of opportunities. We have two more delegates to meet. Let's forge ahead. So we just heard from the director of the environmental law program, but now we hear from the former director of the environmental law program, Denise Antolini, who I know for both David and myself has sort of inspired us to get more involved in this international realm. So Denise, thanks for being so supportive of the idea of taking students to COP. I'm dying to hear your highlight, because I know that you tend to get yourselves into all sorts of interesting situations at meetings like this. So in addition to sharing your highlight for us, can you go back and reflect a little bit on UH's kind of role? Now we've heard from Scott and how UH support the state, and we've heard from David of how it supports the educational journey of the students. What else can we add to that in terms of UH's role in the UN climate policy realm?
Great. Well, thanks, Richard, and you're doing a great job of blending all of these voices. I really want to thank Matt, because if I think back on when we first started to say, like, can the law school engage at international level in the COPs? Matt has been so supportive from day one. And without the credential to attend the COP as part of the UH delegation, I mean, it's very, very difficult. And thanks to Matt and his team, we were able to attend that first COP for us, which was Poland, Katowice in Poland. And the reason I think we're motivated to go and motivated to support our students and others to go is because we have a kuleana and we're really privileged to be where we are. We have a responsibility. And as Director Glenn mentioned, and as Dr. Fletcher mentioned, we have expertise to share, but we also have a lot to learn from the global community. And the immersive experience of a COP, as was mentioned earlier, is like none other. It is a very intense experience. And for those of us who are passionate about the environment, climate, human existence on the planet and human rights, there's nothing like experiencing that week. If you're lucky, you get to go longer, of being with, I don't know if we've mentioned this, but in Glasgow, there were 30,000 delegates that were accredited, right? And 10,000 in the venue approximately every day. So there is no higher level to talk about climate negotiations. There is no higher level to talk about the integration of science, policy, youth, Indigenous people. This is it. So I guess bottom line, speaking of those who are listening today and those who might watch it later at UH, this is the time for UH to be involved as extensively as possible, whether it's research or law and policy or just youth engagement. There's no better venue. So on that note, should also say that this year, in combination with the state's delegation headed by Director Glenn and by Suzanne Case and the governor and others, it was the dream team this year, between the state delegation who was going, there were some NGO leaders who went, like Marty Townsend and Jeff Michelina, and the UH delegation. It was a dream to be in Glasgow with all of these colleagues. So why should UH be involved? Because it is absolutely our responsibility to engage and to bring back. So I hope that's my answer to your first question.
And maybe this is asking for some personal advice, but maybe it'll be applicable to more than just me. So what can we, as faculty members, as university administrators, Office of State Sustainability, what can we do to sort of further support this initiative? How can we make it possible maybe for more students to get even more involved?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So on the one hand, as I just mentioned, and we've talked about before, the actual credential to get to the COP, it's a very challenging process. And thanks to Matt and everybody else at the university, we've been able to share those credentials, but still it's really limited. I mean, there are only 6 of us that were able to go after swapping badges. So I think the challenge and the opportunity would be to design something so that we have an at-home delegation that participates with us virtually. And we, as Professor Foreman mentioned, we did that at the IUCN conference in Marseille. We actually had many people staying at home, participating virtually than actually traveling there. So I think we could design a really neat interdisciplinary kind of prep program, have a virtual delegation that communicates constantly with those who I hope we send a delegation to Egypt and beyond. But I think that's how we can do it. And the university has a lot of resources, not talking money necessarily, and a lot of interest. So I'm sure we could put together something like that. That would be great.
It's something that obviously we're giving lots of thought and attention to, and I want to encourage any students who are interested in Egypt, and now's the time that we need to start planning that. We can't make any promises, right? There's a lot that goes into building a delegation, but expressing your interest is the first step. So you can start with me, you can let me know. Shall we meet the last member of a delegation? We've actually met him already, but I'd like to hear a little bit of his thoughts on the COP experience. So Chip or Dr. Fletcher, I don't know if I was instructed to call you Chip, and there Denise broke the rule, or Professor Antolini broke the rule. So now I don't know what to do. So Chip, this was your first COP, and I'm interested to hear your highlights from the Glasgow experience specifically. And then I know you mentioned a little bit about the importance of UH being involved, but I also know that you're interested in going back again to Egypt. And so I'm curious, sort of why do you want to go back? Which is slightly different from your comments before about why it's important for the university to be involved. What are your thoughts on those questions?
So yeah, my experience at the COP in Glasgow was, who said pandemonium? Maybe it was Denise, maybe also Colin. I really actually talked myself into going simply to be there and experience it, so that it wasn't this, distant thing that I really couldn't relate to any longer. And now I can relate to that. I wanted to get more embedded, or at least familiar with the UN process, with the COP process. I came away with a couple of strong impressions. One was that the COP process, and in fact, the UNFCCC process, is a political process. And as a political process, it's about the art of compromise. And compromising on safety is never a good idea. Nobody would ever compromise on safety if you, certainly when it comes to children, and certainly in the face of crystal clear science stating that this is not a probabilistic safety issue. This is a certain safety issue. There is certainty to the loss of safety for our children in the future. Compromise? That does not seem like the right tool. So that was one overriding concern I had. And I promptly sat down and wrote an op-ed in the Hill about that. The second overriding concern I had was the exclusivity of this thing. I was lucky to get in. I had access to credentials for both weeks, but as Colin mentioned, I think a couple of 100,000 individuals protesting in the streets could not get in. Now, I don't know how you open the doors to everybody and still have an effective process, but brainstorming through the problem of having an open COP, I think that there are ways to do it. Certainly those involved in the detailed negotiations, they need privacy, no doubt, but I don't see why the rest of the COP can't be wide open, and you redesign and rethink what a COP is, right? We are deep into a crisis. The car is crashing. We're in a car crash now. It's too late to put on the seat belt if you didn't have it on. So why are we having, exclusive leaders only conferences on this issue? This needs to be an all-in, everybody involved and educated and engaged. COPs could be a global engagement venue, but instead they are very exclusive. So I think a whole rethink of what these meetings are, and in fact, a whole rethink of the UNFCCC. We need to get away from compromise. And I think, identifying, okay, let's, as a global community, focus on getting renewable energy to the nation of India. That's one example of what we could do. Everybody focus on India and identify a pathway that is less than a decade long, where that entire nation of 1 billion people pivots to renewable energy. And then the next COP, the next year, let's focus on some African countries. Let's focus on some Central American countries. Real action-oriented, focused COPs where the whole world comes together to do something for the developing world, really is what it boils down to. But I'll stop with that. So yeah, I guess I developed a number of opinions after the COP. Many of them critical.
Well, the most valuable kind of opinions in most contexts. And we have some ideas in the chat, which I think are great. Broadcast the COP like the Olympics. Yes, please. That would be fantastic. And maybe, we can think about how to do that just for our own community here at UH. And Tom is also, I think, giving us some more resources that go in the direction of this COP rethink, right? What's the process? What are the upsides of the process? What are the downsides of the process? If I was a student watching this, I would be clicking on every one of those links and trying to soak that up and understand these various perspectives. Matt has asked us as a group, right, as the UH delegation, to think about the question of, what beyond the COP. The COP is just one piece of the climate puzzle, but what can we do as a university community to best equip students for an uncertain climate future? I think some answers to that have come up in the discussion so far. So with Matt's forgiveness, I think I'm going to let that question hang out there a little bit. Maybe we can chime in as we go. There are some questions that have come from the audience. Actually, you've answered some of these already, but a few I think are worth spending some time on. The first that I'd like to get into comes right from what Chip was just talking about, maybe this idea of giving special attention, what in international law we would say is a common but differentiated obligation or duty towards the developing world or the global South. And so we have a question about loss and damage. I'd like to ask one of you to describe what that phrase means for those who haven't been immersed in the COP world. What is loss and damage? And then the question is, this topic of loss and damage came up in Glasgow. There were initial pledges, but what happens next? What's the plan for Egypt on this loss and damage issue? And I'm a law professor, so I will call on people if nobody wants to give us a little loss and damage background. Naima, would it be unfair of me? Oh, it looks like Professor Angelini might be into to save the day there.
I'm going to call on Professor Walsgrove. Do it, Richard, go.
Okay, but I don't want to, my perspective is not the one we're here to hear. But so I will say, when you think about climate policy, there are lots of things we need to achieve. We need to achieve procedural equity. We need to, act urgently. We have to make sure that we're adapting our built environment, our policy environment, our natural world for the changes that are now inevitable and baked into the climate system. We have to undertake mitigation efforts, which means we have to stop emitting the greenhouse gases that are causing the problem. But we can't forget about the fact that the injuries are spread out inequitably. And climate policy has recognized this for decades. There are winners and there are losers in some aspects of climate change. So loss and damage is the question at the UN level about how to allocate responsibility for the inevitable damage that we are seeing today and will continue to see in the future. It's not charity, right? It's not the idea of the developed global North paying for the global South to come along with us. That's actually the opposite. I think if we asked a lot of folks about how we should think about this, the global South is teaching us some lessons. But there are injuries out there that the global North is responsible for that they should pay for. So that's how I conceptualize loss and damage. And it gets talked about a lot at the COPs. Glasgow is the first time where it's become where there have pledges have come up, that there are countries now who are willing to pay into this loss and damage regime. But because I wasn't there, I don't actually know. Well, I don't know where things stand or where it's headed in Egypt. Any of you have something to say? Naima, do you have something to say about loss and damage and what might be coming next year?
So I think I thought more deeply about how loss and damage was addressed at COP26, as opposed to thinking about how it will be addressed in Egypt. But, Pacific Islanders, I'll speak from that perspective, have already experienced substantial loss and damage in profound ways that negatively impact so many aspects of their lives, their health, their ways of being, the connection to their land. So their loss and damage can be economic, but it can also be non-economic dimensions of loss and resulting from climate change. And so I think in Egypt, I'm hopeful that conversations around loss and damage will facilitate more concrete policies and commitments from different countries, so that it's at the forefront, because I think that was part of the disappointment this time round, was that there wasn't a lot of conversation around loss and damage, although there were there was some progress made.
Richard, could I offer?
Please.
Not speaking necessarily to the UN level, but one of the interesting themes that came out of Glasgow was that the local leaders of the city council members, spoke at several of the events. And one of the points that they raised was that Glasgow was the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And so they actually expressed a moral responsibility to the world for the level of greenhouse gas emissions the planet is experiencing, and the nexus of that city with that historic responsibility, which was one of the first times I'd really heard a host nation speak in moral terms about their historic past and how it contributes to today's situation and the obligations that go along with it. Now, whether to the degree the UK embraces that, I think that's obviously a question, but just to even hear it from the host city itself was, I think, a pretty powerful message to give.
ALP has been doing a series of events on restorative justice and how to think about restorative justice, and apology is a huge component of that. I think before I heard these perspectives on something like apology, I thought it would be meaningless, sort of empty rhetoric. But the more I hear, the more I learn, the more I understand it's an important piece of the policy. So thanks for sharing that, Scott. Denise, you have something to add on this topic?
I just wanted to add that what the COP allows us to see in person is the fairly brutal nature of global politics in action. And on loss and damage, and you're right, and there were a lot of things that got onto the agenda of Glasgow for the first time. And at least the mere mention of certain things like loss and damage and the mere mention of the word coal, these are huge accomplishments. Yet at the same time, we see promises broken, accumulated promises, underfunded. And this made such an impact on me. I was watching virtually the second week after returning back to Hawaii and watching the very, very final session of all the plenary and the world leaders on stage and the final adoption of the agenda. And then there was this pause where there was this last minute play by India, China, and the big powers to soften up on the commitment to phase out coal. So I agree. I'm just going back to something that Dr. Fletcher said. These international negotiations are incredibly frustrating, and they are so incremental, and it is politics on a global stage. Now we need to be there to see it, experience it, influence it, but we have to do other things. So it's either working in the marketplace or, as Scott mentioned, it's building up from the grassroots and local governmental action. So I would say, looking forward to Egypt, we cannot think that Egypt's going to solve our problems. And these little things in the agenda will keep moving forward incrementally, but while the earth burns, we have to continue to engage, but we cannot rely on the COPs to save the world.
Yeah, and yet we can't also allow individual communities to shoulder the burden either, right? This is really everybody, all hands on deck scenario, emergency scenario. We have another question that's come in from the audience that it was directed towards Scott. The question is, there will be a change in the administration, and so what can we as a community do? What can UH as a community do to help bring the next governor up to speed, to prioritize climate change, perhaps to convince them to continue to be, in this COP competition, that sort of thing? Do you have any thoughts to share with us there, Scott?
Thanks, Richard. I think Hawaii is very fortunate that we've had a pretty continuous series of governors committed to climate action to one level or another. And that includes a Republican governor that actually initiated the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative and set in place the motion for a 100% renewable energy goal. So I think there's a strong likelihood that whoever becomes our governor will likely have some level of a climate commitment. And the question will be degree and focus, and whether they're interested in engaging at the international stage, or whether they want to stay at the national or just focus on Hawaii. I think that's something that hopefully will come out through the debates and through the primary process as candidates make their positions more fully fleshed out, have opportunities to speak on it, and for the public to engage them on it. And as students, that's the opportunity as students to raise those questions with candidates, attend these forums, attend the coffee talks and the talk story sessions with different candidates, and ask them, what are your plans for this? What role do you see for this? I have a hard time seeing Hawaii really backtracking so much as a question of degree, of forward movement.
The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, in dismissing the Juliana lawsuit, the lawsuit by children against the federal government for seeking a stable climate, they famously said, this is something that if you want to make progress on climate change, you've got the ballot box, which was a silly thing to say to youth who can't yet vote, but it's actually a meaningful thing for us to think about here at UH, those of us who can and will vote in the next election. So thanks for reminding us about the importance of that piece of our obligation, Scott. We're nearing the end, and so I have a task or a request for Joe and Naima. Some final words, thinking about potential students in the audience who may want to go to Egypt or another COP. Do you have a last piece of wisdom you can share with your fellow students, Joe and Naima?
Sure. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, please, Naima, go for it.
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways was that for me, I learned that climate justice means different things to different communities, to different people. And so one example of this is the coal issue for some countries, for example, like in India, where 70% of its energy production for heating homes and food comes from coal. Getting rid of coal as an energy source is simply not feasible at this time. So what can different communities around the world do to support their progress and their movement, their shift away from fossil fuels? So I guess bird's eye view, one of the big questions we have to tackle is what are the precious points of unity where these contrasting perspectives overlap and around which contending peoples can coalesce, and what is the best way to go about this? I left Scotland feeling very grateful for the opportunity to be in attendance, but also somewhat disillusioned with the idea of a high-level dialogue being the most efficient or the end-all be-all for finding climate change solutions. So there's certainly a place for spaces like COP, which closes gaps by producing agreements, but it doesn't solve the problem. So this is an all-hands-on-deck issue. The importance of community involvement and activism at the local level, the state, county, legislative level can't be understated. And this means we need individuals who are committed and who care, working in our backyards to bring awareness and change. Because the climate crisis is something that touches every aspect of every single person's life, whether it be health, education, gender equality, wealth, and poverty. And so this framing of the environmental crisis has to be appreciated at the community and national level so that it can be reflected in international forums like the COP. So yeah, just my 2 cents.
And I think since we're talking about what can students do? I mean, if the student goal is to get to the next COP in Egypt or the one after that, I mean, just referring back to what some of the professors said, you have to make your voice known, your interest known. That's step one, but also do the work, make sure that when you go, you are educated on the issues and that you have reason for going there. It's not just a vacation, because it's a lot of work. You're basically at the event for almost 12 hours a day. But yeah, also making sure that you want to be educated on the process itself, whether it's something that you're interested in being involved with, because it's not the only answer to the climate crisis. As Naima pointed out, there is a community level, there is a subnational level. And even not going doesn't mean that you aren't interested and can't be a part of the solution to the climate crisis. And I'll also reference something that Professor Antolini has told me in our own conversations, is that you have to shoot big. Whether it's shooting big for the COP, something that you may or may not have thought was possible, but also the work that you do. The university does amazing things with the amount of opportunities and the learning that goes on. I think every student who comes to the university is capable of making a difference, and whether it's going to the COP or being part of the solution at the university and the state level. I think Professor Wellsgrove, you mentioned that hanging question: what can the university do to support future students in this endeavor? I mean, it's asking and putting the question to the university: how can the university continue to foster student voices, provide these opportunities, provide networking opportunities, and also make these connections, so that's not just those individuals who go to the COP, but it's everyone in the community who can benefit from it. And so it's great that we're having this conversation right here. I'm looking forward to seeing what else the university can do to continue these great efforts that have been made throughout the years that we've all benefited from on this panel.
Oh, thank you, Joe and Naima. And I think I'll hand it back to you, Matt, with some gratitude that you had the foresight to plant the seed. I think that you can see in the words of Joe and Naima that developing leadership around this issue, as you had hoped, is happening, and it wouldn't have happened without your office and your work. So thanks very much, and thanks for making space to hear from all the delegates today.
My goodness, thank you all so very much for sharing to get the behind the scenes of what happens and what the implications are and the connections. Was really, really vibrant, and you have certainly more than answered that framing question. You've given me a lot to chew on as I continue to consider what else the university can be doing to help effectively equip our students and our communities to navigate these uncertain climate futures. Mahalo also, Richard, for what a brilliant job you did of moderating and weaving those conversations. Thanks, everybody. Mahalo for your time. Ahui ho.